The small town of Milford had always been known for its quiet streets and peaceful atmosphere. But that all changed one autumn evening when 18-year-old Emily Harper went missing without a trace. She was last seen walking home from her part-time job at a local diner, but, as night fell, she never made it back. The news of her disappearance quickly spread, and what initially seemed like a routine missing person case soon turned into something much darker. The entire town was on edge. Friends, family, and even strangers gathered, searching the woods, the streets, and every possible corner of Milford. But Emily was nowhere to be found. The case was covered extensively by the media, and as the weeks went by, it became clear that this wasn't going to be just another local mystery. The search for Emily continued for days, but there were no signs of her. The police expanded their investigation, but as more time passed, the frustration and fear grew. Rumors started to circulate. Some believed she had run away, while others suspected foul play. No one could imagine that Emily's disappearance was part of something much larger than anyone had expected. Her family, especially her mother, was devastated. They clung to the hope that Emily would return, but every passing hour made that seem less and less likely. Then, a breakthrough came when a witness came forward. A man named Paul Stevens, who had been in town on business, claimed to have seen Emily near the edge of the woods on the night she disappeared. But there was something strange about his story. He had been in the area for only a few hours, and yet his memory of the evening seemed to change every time he was questioned. Was he telling the truth? Or was there something he was hiding? The police interviewed Paul multiple times, but each account he gave seemed to contradict the last. He initially claimed to have seen Emily walking alone, but then added that he had seen someone else with her, someone he couldn't describe. He also gave conflicting details about the time he saw her and the direction she had gone. The detectives were suspicious. Paul had no clear reason for being in Milford that evening, and his story didn't seem to add up. But despite these inconsistencies, there was something about his demeanor that made the police hesitate. He appeared nervous, but not in the way one would expect from someone with something to hide. It was almost as if he was afraid to speak the truth. As the investigation continued, the detectives decided to dig deeper into Paul's background. What they found would shock everyone. What the detectives uncovered about Paul Stevens sent chills down their spines. It turned out that Paul had a criminal record, one that he had carefully hidden from the public. He had been convicted of a similar crime in another state, involving the disappearance of a young woman. The case had been closed when the woman's body was found, but there were no clear answers about what had happened to her. Now, with this information in hand, the detectives were certain that Paul had been involved in Emily's disappearance. But the question remained, had he acted alone, or was there someone else behind it all? The police tracked down the location where Paul had stayed during his time in Milford, hoping to find something that would link him directly to Emily. What they found in his room was disturbing to say the least. In Paul's motel room, the police found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, they discovered several personal items belonging to missing persons, including a bracelet that matched the one Emily was wearing on the night she disappeared. The detectives were stunned. Was Paul keeping mementos from his victims? Or was he just a pawn in a larger, more terrifying scheme? The discovery led them to re-examine Paul's involvement in the previous disappearance. Was there a pattern to his crimes that they had missed? As they investigated further, they learned that the missing woman from Paul's past had been reported to have been abducted while walking alone at night, just like Emily. The similarities were too eerie to ignore. Paul was arrested, but the case wasn't over yet. The arrest of Paul Stevens sent shockwaves through Milford. The case seemed solved, but the truth was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. As the police continued to piece together the evidence, they uncovered a chilling connection between Paul and a string of other unsolved disappearances across the country. It seemed that Paul was not acting alone. He was part of a much larger network, a criminal organization that specialized in abducting young women. The discovery of this network led to even more shocking revelations. The people behind the disappearances were highly organized, and they had been operating under the radar for years. The investigation was only just beginning, and the townspeople braced themselves for what was to come. But the real twist of the story was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The arrest of Paul Stevens was only the beginning of a much larger investigation. As the police dug deeper into his past, they discovered that his connection to the series of disappearances was not a coincidence. Paul had been part of an underground group, known for targeting young women from small towns like Milford. The group's methods were calculated and precise. They would find a vulnerable target, isolate them from their families, and then make their move. Their operation was so smooth that until now, they had remained undetected. But Emily's case had broken that pattern. The police knew they had to act quickly to prevent any more disappearances. They formed a special task force, focused on uncovering the full scope of the organization. They hoped that Paul, under pressure, would reveal the names of those behind the operation. But Paul was tight-lipped, only revealing small pieces of information that led nowhere. The more they interrogated him, the more they realized he wasn't the only one involved. There were others in the town who had helped cover up the crimes. With each new piece of evidence, the case grew more sinister. It turned out that the criminal network wasn't confined to Milford. Paul's connections stretched far and wide, and he had traveled to several different states over the years. The detectives began to realize the true scale of the operation. There were dozens of missing persons cases linked to the network, women who had vanished under similar circumstances, their disappearances ignored or dismissed as runaways. But the truth was far darker. As they investigated further, they found that some of the townspeople had been involved, acting as facilitators for the organization. Some had turned a blind eye, others had helped cover their tracks, and a few had even assisted in the abductions themselves. This was more than just a missing persons case. It was a large-scale criminal enterprise, and the network's influence reached deep into local law enforcement and other key positions. The question now was, who could they trust? As the investigation continued, it became clear that the people behind the network were well organized and highly resourceful. They had made sure to cover their tracks in every possible way, leaving behind no tangible evidence to implicate them. It seemed as though they were always one step ahead of the police. However, there was a breakthrough. A former member of the group came forward, claiming to have inside knowledge of their operations. Her name was Rachel Turner, and she had managed to escape the organization years earlier. Rachel's story was chilling. She had been one of the women targeted by the group, but after being held captive for months, she had managed to escape and expose the inner workings of the criminal enterprise. She now feared for her life, as the organization had made it clear that anyone who left would be hunted down. Despite her fear, Rachel was determined to help the police bring the group to justice. Her testimony could be the key to unraveling the entire operation. Rachel's testimony provided valuable insights into the operations of the criminal network, but it also raised more questions. She explained that the group was not just interested in kidnapping and holding women for ransom, they had a far more sinister purpose. The women they abducted were used as part of an underground network for human trafficking. They were sold to the highest bidder, often ending up in dangerous and exploitative situations. Rachel had barely escaped with her life, and she was haunted by the memories of the women who had been sold and never seen again. The police now had a clearer picture of the scope of the crime they were dealing with. But the more they learned, the more dangerous the situation became. The network's reach was vast, and it was becoming increasingly clear that they had allies in high places, people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The detectives knew they were walking a fine line. One wrong move, and they could jeopardize the entire investigation. With Rachel's help, the police began to piece together the locations of several hidden compounds where the organization operated. These locations were well guarded, and anyone who tried to get too close would be met with violence. The detectives knew they had to move fast, but they also knew that any raid could result in more innocent lives being lost. They decided to launch a series of covert operations, working with federal agencies to gather intelligence and plan their moves carefully. The network was clearly aware that they were being investigated, and they had begun to move their operations underground, using new methods to conceal their activities. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was mounting. If they couldn't shut down the organization soon, more women would disappear, and the world would never know what had really happened to Emily Harper. The clock was ticking. In a daring move, the police set up a sting operation, sending an undercover agent into the heart of the network. The agent, posing as someone looking to purchase women, infiltrated one of the organization's hidden sites. It was a dangerous gambit, but they had little choice. The agent's information would be critical in taking down the group from the inside. As the operation unfolded, the police began to close in on the network's leaders, tracking their every move and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the deeper the agent went, the more dangerous things became. The network was more paranoid than ever, and anyone who looked like they could be a threat was eliminated without hesitation. It became clear that they would do anything to protect their operation. As the agent's life hung in the balance, the authorities held their breath, hoping they had enough to take down the organization once and for all. The undercover operation was in full swing. Agent Miller, posing as a wealthy buyer, had successfully gained the trust of the criminal network's leaders. He was now deep within the organization, navigating through their secretive, shadowy world. The police monitored every step of his movements, communicating through coded messages, and tracking every lead he provided. It was a delicate balance. One false move, and Miller's life would be in jeopardy. As the days passed, Miller was introduced to the darker side of the network. Auctions where women were sold to the highest bidder. The descriptions of these women matched those of the missing people the authorities had been searching for, including Emily Harper. Miller could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to gather enough evidence to bring down the leaders, but the deeper he delved, the more dangerous the situation became. The stakes had never been higher. Miller's cover was starting to crack. The network had been watching him closely, and it was clear they were starting to suspect something was wrong. One evening, while at a secret meeting with the leaders of the group, Miller overheard a conversation that sent chills down his spine. One of the men in the group was talking about Emily Harper. He mentioned her by name, discussing her availability in a way that made it clear she was no longer alive. The realization hit Miller like a punch to the stomach. Emily wasn't just missing, she was likely dead. The idea that her fate had been sealed long before the police had even realized the full scope of the operation haunted him. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was a much darker and more horrific reality. Despite his fear, Miller knew he couldn't back out now. He had to gather as much information as possible to shut down the organization once and for all. With each passing day, Miller grew more entangled in the web of deception. He had learned the inner workings of the organization, their leaders, their methods, their next target. But the deeper he went, the more he realized the extent of their influence. The criminal network had connections in law enforcement, local businesses, and even within the government. As Miller continued to gather intel, he uncovered a shocking fact. The network's reach was global. The group wasn't just operating in the United States. They had expanded internationally, trafficking women across borders and laundering money through various channels. Every piece of the puzzle was more disturbing than the last. Miller knew he couldn't do this alone. The authorities would need to act quickly and decisively, or they would risk losing everything. But despite the mounting pressure, Miller remained determined to bring the group down, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. The tension was palpable. Miller's communication with the outside world had become sporadic and cryptic, as the network had begun to monitor his movements more closely. Every meeting, every conversation felt like a game of cat and mouse. At one point, Miller was approached by one of the leaders, a man named Victor Hayes. Hayes had been suspicious of Miller for a while, and his suspicions were now confirmed. "You're not who you say you are," Hayes said, his cold eyes locking onto Miller's. The agent froze. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He couldn't afford to blow his cover now. "You've been watching me," Miller said, his voice steady, trying to mask the panic rising inside him. Hayes smirked. "You're smarter than I thought." In that moment, Miller knew that the clock was ticking. Hayes had figured him out, and it wouldn't be long before the rest of the network would catch on. The danger had never been greater. Miller's cover was officially blown. Hayes ordered his men to take Miller to a remote location for questioning. The agent was now a prisoner of the very people he had been trying to infiltrate. As he was blindfolded and thrown into the back of a van, Miller's mind raced. He knew that without backup, his chances of escaping alive were slim. But there was one thing that kept him going: the information he had gathered. If the authorities could intercept the data he had hidden on a flash drive, they would have everything they needed to shut down the organization. Miller had planted the drive in a safe place, but now he wasn't sure if anyone would be able to retrieve it in time. The pressure of the situation was unbearable. As the van sped through the night, Miller's thoughts turned to Emily and the other women who had suffered at the hands of the network. He had to survive. He had to make sure their story was told. Just when Miller thought all hope was lost, a stroke of luck came his way. As the van pulled into the hidden compound, a commotion broke out among the guards. Miller could hear raised voices and the sound of a car speeding off. In the chaos, a single figure appeared in the shadows, a fellow undercover agent who had managed to infiltrate the network and was now attempting a rescue. The agent cut through the van's lock and with a swift motion, freed Miller. "We don't have much time," the agent whispered. "We need to get out of here, now." They ran through the compound, dodging guards and making their way to a safe exit. It was a heart-pounding escape, but they made it out alive. Just as they reached the edge of the compound, the sound of sirens grew louder. The authorities had arrived. Miller's data had been recovered, and the takedown of the criminal network was underway. The rescue operation had succeeded, but the case was far from over. There were still many pieces to the puzzle, and many questions left unanswered. With the evidence from Miller's undercover operation in hand, the police now had everything they needed to launch a full-scale takedown of the criminal network. The authorities, both local and federal, mobilized quickly, coordinating a series of raids across multiple locations. The first target was the compound where Miller had been held captive, a sprawling facility hidden in a remote part of the state. As the SWAT teams stormed the compound, they found evidence of the women who had been trafficked, some still being held in dark, cramped rooms. The sight was harrowing. The survivors were rescued and taken into protective custody, but the network's leaders, Victor Hayes and his associates, had already gone into hiding. It was clear that this operation was far from over. Hayes and his allies had managed to escape once again, but the authorities were closing in. The criminal empire was crumbling, but the mastermind behind it all was still free. The police knew it was only a matter of time before they would get their chance to bring Hayes to justice. Despite the success of the raid, the authorities faced a major obstacle. The criminal network was vast and well organized, with hidden channels for communication and escape. Victor Hayes was not just a local criminal. He was a part of a much larger syndicate. The police uncovered a network of safe houses and underground tunnels, leading them to believe that Hayes had connections that spanned across the globe. As investigators pieced together the information from the raid, they realized that the group had been operating under the radar for decades. The missing persons cases from around the country were now all linked to the syndicate, with Hayes as the central figure. The investigation grew more complex as each lead led to another layer of darkness. The authorities now faced a race against time to stop the network before more lives were lost. But Hayes had one final card to play. The police were now closing in on Victor Hayes' final hideout, an isolated mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion had been purchased under a false name, and its location had been carefully concealed. But thanks to the intelligence gathered from Miller's rescue, they knew they were close. The authorities moved cautiously, setting up a perimeter and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Inside the mansion, Hayes and his closest associates were holed up, barricading themselves in. The tension in the air was palpable as the final showdown began to take shape. The authorities had been patient, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They knew Hayes was dangerous, but this time they were prepared. With SWAT teams ready and a solid plan in place, they began their assault. The moment they breached the mansion's gates, the fight for justice was about to become a deadly game of cat and mouse. As the police stormed the mansion, chaos erupted. Hayes and his associates had prepared for this day, setting up defenses and escape routes throughout the house. The authorities were met with heavy resistance, as gunfire rang out from inside the mansion. Officers dove for cover as SWAT teams moved in, clearing rooms one by one. Inside, the situation grew even more volatile. Hayes was desperate, willing to do anything to escape capture. As the gunfight escalated, one of the officers was injured, adding to the urgency of the operation. The police knew they couldn't let Hayes get away again. They had to end this now. After hours of tense confrontation, they finally cornered Hayes in the mansion's basement, where he was preparing to flee. It was a dramatic standoff. Hayes was determined to make his escape, but the police were determined to bring him to justice. In a final act of defiance, Hayes attempted to flee, but the authorities were too quick. With one final surge, they tackled him to the ground and arrested him. Victor Hayes was finally in custody. The police had managed to apprehend the leader of the criminal network, bringing an end to a terrifying chapter of human trafficking and abduction. But the victory was bittersweet. The damage had already been done. Hundreds of women had been sold into a nightmarish world of slavery, their lives destroyed. And despite the arrest of Hayes, the authorities knew that the remnants of the network still existed, hiding in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity. As Hayes was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defiance, the victims began to speak out. Rachel Turner, who had survived the network's clutches, was among the first to testify, recounting the horrors she had endured. Her testimony was instrumental in securing the conviction of Hayes, but the battle was far from over. The full extent of the network's reach was still unknown, and the investigation continued. Every new piece of evidence uncovered more victims, more criminals, and more danger. The question remained, how far did the syndicate's influence stretch? The arrest of Victor Hayes was a major victory for the authorities, but it was only the beginning of a long process to dismantle the network. Over the following months, the police conducted further raids, uncovering more safe houses and trafficking routes. With Hayes' arrest, many of the remaining leaders were apprehended, but a few managed to slip through the cracks. The survivors of the operation were given new identities and placed in protective custody, their lives forever changed by the horrors they had endured. But there was still much work to be done. The criminal syndicate had deep roots, and it would take years to fully unravel their operations. The world would never forget Emily Harper, the young woman whose disappearance sparked the investigation that led to the downfall of one of the most notorious human trafficking networks in history. And though justice had been served, the scars of the case would remain for those affected, forever changing their lives. The arrest of Victor Hayes and the subsequent dismantling of the criminal network marked a turning point, but the aftermath of the investigation was far from over. The victims of the trafficking ring, many of whom had been held captive for years, began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives. Rachel Turner, one of the most outspoken survivors, became an advocate for the other women, helping them find support and resources as they began their long road to recovery. As the trials against Hayes and his associates loomed, the survivors, still haunted by their experiences, faced the overwhelming task of reliving their worst nightmares in court. The public's attention had shifted to the trial, where the truth about the network's operation would finally be revealed. But for the survivors, the courtrooms felt like a second battleground, a place where they would be forced to confront the pain they had buried for so long. The stakes were high, and the pressure on the victims to testify was enormous. Yet, they were determined to see justice done. As the trial against Victor Hayes began, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Victims took the stand one by one, recounting their horrifying experiences of being sold, traded, and discarded by the network. Their testimony was raw and powerful, and the evidence presented painted a clear picture of the scale of the organization. For many of the victims, the trial was a catharsis, a chance to finally speak out and have their voices heard. But it was also an emotional and psychological ordeal. Emily Harper's family, who had spent years in anguish, finally saw the truth behind their daughter's disappearance. The pain of learning what had happened to Emily was immeasurable, but it also gave them a sense of closure. As the defense tried to discredit the testimonies, the prosecution remained steadfast, knowing that the women's courage was the key to securing justice. Hayes' arrogance and defiance in the courtroom only further fueled the desire for justice, and the case began to capture national attention. As the trial continued, new revelations came to light, further complicating the case. It was discovered that Hayes wasn't the sole architect of the trafficking ring. Several powerful figures had been involved in the syndicate, including corrupt politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officers. The depth of the corruption was staggering. The investigation had uncovered a vast network of individuals who had enabled the trafficking operation, turning a blind eye for profit, power, and influence. As these names came to light, the media frenzy grew, and the pressure on the authorities to hold everyone involved accountable intensified. But with each new arrest, there were more questions. Who else was involved? How many more were still out there, operating in the shadows? The authorities had captured a few key figures, but many were still at large. As the trial approached its conclusion, the truth was becoming more complex and more dangerous. The trial culminated in a tense and dramatic moment. Victor Hayes took the stand in his own defense, attempting to shift blame onto his associates and claiming that he had been forced into the operation by powerful individuals. His attempt to avoid full responsibility was met with anger from the victims and their families. Hayes' claims were inconsistent with the evidence and the testimonies of those he had victimized. As the defense tried to manipulate the narrative, the prosecution presented its final devastating argument. Hayes was the mastermind behind the network. The final testimonies from the survivors, including Rachel Turner, were emotional and powerful, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but they ultimately reached a verdict. Hayes was convicted on multiple counts of human trafficking, abduction, and murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and grief, as justice had been served, but it came at a heavy price. With the conviction of Victor Hayes, the authorities turned their focus to dismantling the rest of the network. The survivors of the trafficking ring were given new identities and placed in witness protection, but their lives would never be the same. For Rachel Turner, the trial had been both a victory and a painful reminder of the horrors she had endured. Though she had helped bring down the network, she knew there was still much work to be done. She became a powerful advocate for the survivors, working to ensure that their voices were heard, and that the system would change to prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. As the authorities continued to investigate the remaining members of the syndicate, Rachel found herself confronting a new challenge: the long-term effects of the trauma she and the other survivors had experienced. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Months passed since the conviction, and while the survivors tried to rebuild their lives, the memory of the case continued to haunt them. The media coverage had waned, but for those involved, the impact remained. Emily Harper's family, though relieved that justice had been served, found no solace in the knowledge of their daughter's fate. They had spent years searching for answers, only to find that their daughter had been one of many. The trauma lingered, but the family found strength in the knowledge that her story had helped expose the true scope of the network's operation. In the years that followed, Rachel Turner's advocacy efforts led to significant changes in the way authorities handled trafficking cases. New laws were passed, creating a stronger framework for protecting vulnerable individuals and ensuring that those involved in trafficking rings were held accountable. The case had left its mark on the world, and while the scars would never fade, it had sparked a movement for change. As the dust began to settle from the conviction of Victor Hayes and the collapse of the human trafficking ring, the survivors and their families slowly returned to their lives, though the scars remained. Rachel Turner, now a tireless advocate for trafficking victims, continued her work, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and raising awareness about the ongoing dangers of human trafficking. But no matter how much progress she made, she could never shake the memory of the trauma she and the other survivors had endured. She often found herself haunted by the faces of the women she had left behind in the trafficking network, wondering what had happened to them after the operation had been shut down. She began to wonder, was the fight truly over? Or was it only just beginning? The case had been a landmark moment in the battle against trafficking, but Rachel knew there was still a long road ahead. The survivors had been freed, but the world of human trafficking was far more complex and insidious than anyone had realized. The case of the Milford Network had inspired a worldwide movement. Law enforcement agencies around the globe began to collaborate more closely, sharing intelligence and resources to take down trafficking rings before they could expand. New laws and policies were enacted, with harsher penalties for those caught in the act of trafficking. International organizations, NGOs, and victim advocacy groups rallied behind the survivors, helping them rebuild their lives and regain their sense of dignity. But even as the fight against trafficking gained ground, new threats emerged. The survivors who had been freed from the clutches of the syndicate often found themselves struggling with the psychological aftermath. PTSD, anxiety, and feelings of isolation became common as they tried to adjust to a world they hadn't seen in years. Rachel's advocacy began to shift towards providing better mental health resources for trafficking survivors, understanding that true healing would require more than just physical freedom. The global impact of the Milford case was felt not only by survivors and their families, but also by the law enforcement community. The case had exposed a major flaw in the way human trafficking investigations were conducted. Before the Milford operation, trafficking was often seen as a local or isolated issue, but the scope of the syndicate's operations revealed how widespread and organized the networks truly were. In response, police agencies began to focus on dismantling trafficking rings with a more coordinated international approach. Special task forces were created, and regional alliances formed. Technology played a critical role in these operations, with new surveillance systems and digital tracking tools that could track suspects across borders. But even with all this newfound cooperation and technology, law enforcement officials knew that the fight wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before new networks would rise up in the shadows, looking to take the place of the one that had been destroyed. The struggle against human trafficking had become a never-ending battle, one that demanded constant vigilance. Rachel Turner's advocacy efforts began to gain serious momentum. She became a prominent figure in the fight against human trafficking, working alongside lawmakers to draft new legislation that would hold traffickers accountable and provide better protections for survivors. One of the most groundbreaking pieces of legislation was the Survivor Protection Act, which ensured that survivors of trafficking had access to mental health services, housing, and legal assistance. The act also created specialized programs to help survivors reintegrate into society after their traumatic experiences. Rachel was proud of what she had achieved, but she knew that the fight wasn't over. The survivors she spoke to every day reminded her of how much more needed to be done. Every success, every new law passed, felt like a small victory in a war that would continue to rage for years to come. But Rachel was determined to keep fighting. The faces of the women who had been lost to the syndicate pushed her forward, reminding her of why she couldn't stop. One of the most unexpected turns in the case came when a series of undercover operations revealed that some of the missing women from the Milford case were being held in other countries. This discovery shook the authorities to their core. Despite the collapse of the trafficking network, its tentacles had spread far beyond the borders of the United States. International law enforcement agencies worked together to trace the women, and a coordinated rescue mission was launched across multiple countries. While some survivors were finally brought to safety, the effort exposed how difficult it was to track these networks across international lines. It was clear that in the war against human trafficking, borders were meaningless. Rachel, watching from the sidelines, felt a renewed sense of urgency. Every day, women were being trafficked across the world, hidden in plain sight. While victories were being achieved, the global scope of human trafficking made it a battle that would take lifetimes to win. As the years passed, the impact of the Milford case continued to reverberate. Rachel Turner's advocacy work had helped bring national and international awareness to the issue of human trafficking. New global coalitions were formed to combat trafficking at its roots, focusing on prevention, victim protection, and stricter penalties for those involved. Survivor support programs expanded, offering comprehensive care that included education, job placement, and legal assistance. While Rachel had made tremendous strides, she knew there was much more work ahead. Trafficking remained a pervasive issue, and the fight was far from over. But Rachel found strength in knowing that she had helped shine a light on this dark corner of the world. With the survivors at her side, she would continue the fight, determined to make sure that no more women would have to suffer the same fate that Emily Harper and so many others had. The world had changed because of this case, but it was still a world at war with a deep-rooted evil. Years after the arrest of Victor Hayes and the collapse of the criminal trafficking network, the legacy of the case continued to shape public awareness. Human trafficking was no longer an issue buried in the shadows. It had become a central topic in national and international discussions. The survivors, with Rachel Turner leading the charge, had helped change the way the world viewed trafficking. Laws were tougher, systems of support for survivors were in place, and advocacy groups flourished. But the story didn't end with the trials. The world had been forever changed by Emily Harper's disappearance and the ensuing investigation. The community in Milford, once a quiet, close-knit town, had been shaken to its core. It wasn't just about finding the culprits or bringing justice. It was about creating a new future, one in which more people were aware of the invisible dangers lurking in plain sight. Rachel stood at the forefront of this movement, knowing that, while much had been accomplished, much more needed to be done. But for the first time, she felt hopeful about the future. As the years went by, Rachel continued to fight for the causes that had shaped her life after escaping the trafficking ring. The Survivor Protection Act, which she had worked so hard to get passed, had not only offered support to countless survivors, but had also inspired other countries to follow suit. Human trafficking, once a taboo subject, was now discussed openly, and efforts to prevent it were widespread. Rachel had turned her pain into purpose, channeling her strength into creating safe spaces for those who had suffered as she had. However, her work was not without its challenges. The darker side of human trafficking was often difficult to confront, and there were moments when it seemed like the fight was endless. But Rachel took solace in the victories, knowing that every person she helped, every law passed, and every story told made a difference. She had helped turn the tide, and as long as she had breath, she would continue to push for change. The families of the victims had also been profoundly affected by the events of the case. Emily Harper's family, devastated by the loss of their daughter, found some semblance of peace in knowing that the investigation had not only brought justice for Emily, but had also exposed a global criminal operation. They knew they would never be able to erase the pain of losing Emily, but they took comfort in the fact that their daughter's story had been a catalyst for change. The ripple effect of the Milford case extended far beyond the town, reaching other families who had suffered similar fates. Though the pain of the past would always be there, the hope that the world had been made safer for future generations was a small consolation. Emily's family became vocal advocates for other missing persons and human trafficking victims, ensuring that their daughter's legacy would continue to help others. Despite the progress made in the years following the takedown of the Milford network, the fight was far from over. The rise of new trafficking networks was a constant threat, and many individuals involved in the syndicate had yet to be brought to justice. While the authorities had made significant strides, there were still dark corners of the world where trafficking flourished. The fight was now global, and it was clear that no matter how much had been accomplished, there would always be more to do. For Rachel Turner and the survivors, this became a daily reality. They knew that change required a continuous effort, lives depended on it. Rachel's resolve had never been stronger. The case had shown her the ugly truth of human trafficking, but it had also revealed the incredible resilience of those who fought against it. They had not only survived, they had thrived, and they would continue to do so as long as the fight persisted. Years after the trial and conviction of the key players in the trafficking ring, Rachel stood before a new generation of advocates, survivors, and policymakers. The legacy of the Milford case had transformed the way the world viewed human trafficking, but it was clear that the fight had to continue. With technology constantly evolving, so too did the tactics used by traffickers. The authorities had to stay ahead of the curve, using innovative methods to identify and prevent trafficking before it occurred. At the same time, Rachel and other survivors pushed for education programs that would teach young people about the dangers of trafficking and how to protect themselves. Rachel's work was far from finished, but the progress made over the years was undeniable. As she stood in front of a large crowd at a global conference, sharing her story and urging everyone to take action, Rachel knew that her daughter, Emily, and the countless other victims had not died in vain. They had sparked a revolution of change, and that would be their legacy. As Rachel looked out over the sea of faces at the conference, she felt a deep sense of gratitude and determination. The world had changed in ways she had never imagined, and the survivors had been at the forefront of that transformation. It was still a world filled with dangers, but it was a world that now saw trafficking for what it was, an inexcusable crime. And as long as there was breath in her lungs, Rachel knew she would continue her work until no more women, children, or men were forced to suffer the horrors she had endured. She looked back on her journey, from the nightmare of captivity to the bright light of justice, and realized how far she had come. The fight had taken everything from her, but it had also given her a sense of purpose. In the face of unimaginable darkness, she had found a way to help others and to honor the memory of those who had been lost. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.